We read in the portion of Yisro. Yisro was the father of Moshe. Some background on who Yisro was. The Gemara tells us that Paro had three advisors. Yisro was an advisor to Paro. Bilam, the prophet of the nations, who was also a sorcerer, and Job. These were the three advisors to Paro. Paro was the monarch of the most advanced civilization of existence. And Paro was concerned that the Jews, proliferating as they were, ultimately they're going to take over the country and they're going to join with their enemies and they're going to drive them out of the land. Bilam comes up, of course, it was a baseless concern. It was paranoia. It was rooted in his anti-Semitism. And Bilam gives the final solution approach. Enslave them, demand quotas. If they can't produce the quotas, you will destroy them. Yisro hears this. Now, who are the Jews? If not for their ancestor, Yosef, they would have perished due to the famine. They are the purest nation. They never ever displayed any of that there's even a basis for this concern. But yet, you're treating these innocent people that you should be beholden to, that all your wealth and all your glory is due to them, and you're enslaving them. Yisro, in protest, flees from Egypt. He cannot tolerate this miscarriage of justice. Job remains silent. Okay? That Yisro was able, despite the possible ramifications and consequences, it's the ultimate insult. Because Paro embraced this solution, and Yisro was saying, I disagree. It's unconscionable. How do you treat these people? Yisro, for the sake of truth, he wasn't concerned about the consequences. How Paro may react, how he may be perceived. He picked himself up and protest left, went back to Midian. But the whole world was okay with this. These Jews, we have to control them because you never know what could happen. So Yisro had a different emotional, mental quality makeup than all humanity. All humanity remained silent. Yisro cannot remain silent. He left in protest. So the way Yisro processed things differently than all other human beings. Okay? The Jewish people leave Egypt. And there's a Kriyas Yamsuf, there's a splitting of the Red Sea. The Egyptians' armies with the chariot corps and all their wealth go down in the sea. 250 miracles took place at the splitting of the sea. In the Oz Yashir, we read how the nations of the world, they were paralyzed from fear. They trembled, overwhelmed with fear. They melted. And Yisro heard all this. Afterwards, we're confronted with the Amalekites. They attack us. In the words of Chazal, it's analogous to a person who's unstable, who jumps into a scalding bath and gets burnt, but factually, Amalek took the wind out of the sails of the Jewish people. The Jews were held in such a level of awe and esteem. There's no mad band attacks us. They undermined God's glory. God says, because of that, my throne and my name is not complete until they're obliterated from the face of the earth, from under the heavens. Now Yisro hears this. He, as God, displayed his majesty at a level in the history of existence he never ever displayed it. And the whole world was aware of what happened there. The sea closing on the Egyptians and what happened there. What should have the world done at that moment? They should immediately done what Yisro did. Pick themselves up and say, we want to be with the winner. We want to become part of the Jewish people. Yisro was the only lonely human being on the face of the earth who was not part of Jewish people, said, I'm giving up all my glory, regardless of what it's worth. I'm doing a beeline straight out to the desert to become part of the Jewish people. Vayishma Yisro, Kohen Midjan, Chosid Moshe. Yisro, the high priest of Midjan, or the idolatrous priest, or the sheik of Midjan, the father of Moshe, he heard all that God had done on behalf of Moshe and the Jews. Kriyas Yamsuf, the splitting of the sea, the war with the Amalekites. He heard. What is hearing? Everybody heard. You know, in Yiddish, the two words, to hear in Yiddish is to hear, zeheren. Deheren means to understand. Person said, did you hear what I said? Yes. But you don't comprehend and understand the ramifications and the profundity of what I said. Yisro not only heard the event, he was able to internalize what that event meant and what it signified. And because he understood and internalized it, nothing's the equivalent of that. Therefore, he's given up everything to go there. The world heard it, knew what happened, but they couldn't appreciate and relate to the innate value of what that is. Therefore, they continued on their route. They didn't change as much as an iota. All they were overwhelmed. Why did Yisro have that capacity? And they didn't have that capacity. So we could say, as I just pointed out, Yisro, his level of integrity, his understanding of what truth is. Yisro would not compromise on the standard of truth and justice for anything in the world, regardless of its consequences. He saw things for what they were. That was his grasp, his level of clarity and internalization. Therefore, you could say he processed what he heard differently than everyone else processed it. Because you understand, what happened with Yisro was before Moshe Rabbeinu was born. The final solution was given before Moshe Rabbeinu was born. Moshe was born afterwards. Moshe flees to Midjan, and he marries Yisro's daughter. Zipporah was the wife of Yisro, was the wife of Moshe. Now, there's a background. How did Yisro recognize that Moshe was a special person? So the Torah tells us the story. He himself fled as a fugitive. He arrives in Midjan and he sees these women, shepherdesses. They come with their flocks to water them, and they're attacked by the male shepherds. Moshe immediately jumps into the fray, fights off the male shepherds, and these women, they go back with their flocks earlier than they would have. So the father asks them, how did you come home so early? So they tell him the whole story. They were attacked, and an Egyptian man saved them. So Yisro says to them, Why didn't you invite him home to break bread with us? What he was alluding to, he's maybe a qualified husband for one of you people. How did you forget about him? Why did you leave him back where he is? And he was summoned immediately. So the Maral of Prague points out, Yisro wasn't an ordinary person. When he saw something of quality, he recognized it. What did he see about Moshe Rabbeinu that he understood? Maybe he was some vagrant. And he came to their rescue, fought him off. How did Yisro immediately know that he was qualified to marry one of his daughters? Now, even if Moshe Rabbeinu didn't want to be compensated, financially compensated, but a person who does such a heroic act, selfless act, even puts his life in danger, minimally, he would accompany them home, say, I'm delivering your daughters in safety. He'd want some degree of acknowledgement for what he did. He doesn't follow them home. The man's not interested in being acknowledged. Yisro never saw such a display of humility. Pure, selfless to do the right thing. But what about ego? It's the daughters of the Sheikh of Midyat. You know, we always want to score points. Doesn't follow him home. Yisro immediately recognized this is a special person. His humility is phenomenal. That's the man I want for a son-in-law. You know, many years ago, there was a book written by Dershowitz. It was called Chutzpah. What was the book? What was the principle behind that book? If you want to get ahead in life, Wall Street, you got to be a shark, a barracuda, aggressive, chutzpah. A person who's truly humble. How do they look at that person? How does society, the financial community, how do they recognize that type of person? He's a wimp. He's weak-spined. He's a worm at best. So what we esteem and revere and value, the world says he's a nobody. With his wealth, with his capability, he doesn't appreciate who he is. He's out to lunch. He doesn't have sufficient focus. Yisro was a person of integrity, quality. And when he saw quality, he appreciated what was. That level of humility was valued and esteemed and revered by Yisro. He will be my son-in-law. And he married Tzipora. He had 2 children from her. Yisro was exposed to Moshe Rabbeinu for 60 years. This is post-story where he fled from Egypt. So he had a capacity to be able to be impressed and influenced. The Torah makes it a point. Yisro, the Kohen Midjan, he's identified as Moshe's father-in-law, heard all that had transpired on behalf of Moshe and the Jews. A person who has that level of so-called mentoring by the greatest Jew who ever walked the face of the earth, Moshe Rabbeinu. What is his capacity to internalize anything? We can't even relate what it means to be within the proximity of Moshe Rabbeinu. Chazal tell us, Tov l'tzadik, Tov l'shcheno. It's good for the tzaddik, and anybody who's within his proximity, it's good for him also. Because almost by osmosis, you're affected and touched by that tzaddik's presence, by his behavior. He creates an energy which you're touched by. So the Torah is telling us, why was Yisro able to appreciate, which the world could not appreciate? Because he was closer to Moshe. Because he was Moshe's father-in-law. The Moshe's father, he had a relationship which no one else had with Moshe, and therefore he was a different human being. His capacity was different than anyone else. Hear all that Hashem had done for Moshe and for the Jewish people. Then it concludes, Yehotzi Hashem es Yisro Mitzrayim. He took the Jewish people out of Egypt. Rashi says, besides the Bechilta, Zu Gadol al Kulam. Taking the Jews out of Egypt was the ultimate level of accomplishment. Split the sea, the war with the Amalekites, provided the manna, provided the wellspring of Miriam. But the ultimate accomplishment was he took the Jews out of Egypt. So the obvious question is, a person is incarcerated in Alcatraz or Sing Sing, whatever the penitentiary may be. And the prisoners, they kill all the guards, they kill the warden, and they blow out the walls of the prison. And they walk out. Could you imagine what they did? There was no prison left. They walked out of the prison. Therefore, of course, it's understood. The feat is they killed the guards, the prison, and the warden, and they were able to destroy the prison. But leaving the prison now, that's easy because there's nothing keeping them confined there. But the ultimate accomplishment was Hashem took us out of Egypt. The splitting of the sea, that's secondary to that. The manna, that's secondary to that. The war of the Amalekites, the victory, that's secondary to that. The ultimate is we left Egypt. Of course we left. We were driven out of Egypt. After the 10th plague, we left with unbelievable wealth. Why is this the greatest of all the miracles? What happened to us in Egypt? We lived for 210 years. When we left Egypt, what were we? We were pagans. We were idolaters. We were infected with spiritual infectious waste, being exposed to witchcraft, and the whole environment was a personification of evil. Just being there, we fell to a level which we were at the point of spiritual extinction. That's where we were at. God took us out at that moment. He had no choice because we would have gone into spiritual oblivion at that moment. But what happened from the moment we left? Every moment out of Egypt, every day, we took a notch up. We're at the 49th level of impurity, but every day closer to Sinai, we rose a level, we gained a level of spiritual purity. Until we arrived at Sinai, we already were holding the 49th level gate of spiritual purity. Could you imagine? A person has more drugs in his blood than blood. He has more alcohol in his system than blood. Multiple internalizations of whatever it may be, which could kill a person 1,000 times over. And somehow this person came up with a miraculous therapy. You go into this detox location, he's able to expunge and purify and purge everything from that person as if he never took a drug in his life. Healthier than the healthiest person. Miracle. It gets the FDA approval, multi-billion-dollar company. Could you imagine? Yisro understood the evil of Egypt like nobody understood it. He was one of the advisors to Egypt. He had an appreciation of what that was. How do you take a people out of Egypt after being spiritually so deficient and so compromised. It's beyond recovery. And yet, he took the Jewish people out of Egypt. He was able to somehow expunge and extract and detox whatever the Egyptians did to them. This is beyond. Destroying Egypt is one thing. What about we being victims of that? You know, you speak to people who are children of Holocaust survivors. What the Jews went through even before they arrived in the concentration camps, and what they experienced in the concentration camps, what they witnessed. God forbid we should never have an inkling of what they experience. Emotional, mental trauma, the terror they experienced, what they saw, their loved ones, their children, their siblings, their parents, brutally murdered by these demonic people. Every one of them says when they came out of the camps, they were not normal people. Humanly, it was impossible to come out of that and be stable. There was a certain instability in them because to be able to survive that, it was an impossibility. Physically, it was a miracle. Emotionally, that they were able to achieve what they were able to achieve was a miracle. But they were all very seriously scarred for what they experienced and what they saw. The children of these people were affected by many things that the parents had due to their experiences in the Holocaust. And some people said 3 generations later, we're still victims of the Holocaust because of certain levels of upbringings and concerns that a normal person would not have. Takes generations to overcome all that. And here, they leave Egypt immediately. The detoxification starts immediately. To reach a point where there's no trace of that. Unheard of. And who appreciates this? That's Yisro. Because he understood evil like nobody understood evil. The Midrash tells us that he worshipped every deity in the world. And he came to the conclusion that there's only one true religion, and it's called monotheism. Paganism has no basis for it. Doesn't have any standing whatsoever. And because he understood it so well, the ins and outs of all this, he was amazed that the Jews could recover so quickly. Nothing less than miraculous, beyond miraculous. But you realize at the Yam Suf, at the splitting of the sea, we say in the Haggadah, according to Rabbi Akiva, there were 250 miracles that took place. You know what that's called? It's called mega dose of spiritual antibiotic, beyond mega doses. It's cocktails which destroy every microscopic spiritual bacteria. 250 miracles, you know what that means? It's unheard of. So it's not only the Egyptians were destroyed, but besides seeing God in a level that even Yechezkel, the prophet, did not witness, they saw his majesty exposed to all that. There were endless miracles. Why was it so needed? Because this was the miraculous cure. This was the miracle therapy that they had gone through to expunge whatever they experienced in Egypt. That's what it was about. Therefore, Yisro was amazed. And he said, because he had the capacity to appreciate what that was, truth, monotheism, which he believed in, and this is the monotheistic God, that he's able even to bring that about. You know, this is the equivalent of Tchias HaMesim. This is like resurrection. These people are resurrected. They had no power of choice. Now all of a sudden they're fully functional. Rational people to make rational decisions, not based on their previous experiences, the paranoia that they had, and all the other issues that they had. It's interesting. Many people were hurt very badly due to the Holocaust. I remember when they captured Eichmann, Yimach Shmo v'Zichro, he personally brought about the final solution for Hungarian Jewry. In 1 year, he murdered 900,000 Jews. That's how mechanized he had that killing machine in Hungary, Eichmann. And when the Mossad captured him in Argentina, brought him to Israel, there was a front cover issue of Time magazine, and it said in bold letters, God forbid, it said, God is dead. Meaning, if there could be a Holocaust, where was God? That was the bold letters on the cover of Time magazine. And they showed, if you remember, that newsreels that they showed in the movie theaters, that the Nazis, everything was recorded. There was nothing they did not photograph and record. And there were newsreels that they had, which they showed in the movies, if you went to the movies to see them, of how they actually did all these atrocities. When they come into communities and how they would murder people, and what they would do. It was unbelievable. God is dead. And many Jews were hurt very badly by this. If you read a little bit about the DP camps, the displaced person camps after the war, for the survivors who survived, there was a person who was a giant, a Torah giant, who literally saved, emotionally, mentally, thousands of young teenagers. His name was the Kloisenberger Rebbe. His name was Rav Yekusiel Yehuda Halberstam. And he spoke the first Yom Kippur at Faldefang, which had a few thousand Jewish survivors, Holocaust survivors. And he spoke. And he told them, although you have no mothers and you have no fathers, I will be your father, I will be your mother. Anything you need. He was a Torah giant. And he gave them all confidence and gave them value and gave them hope that there's a future to rebuild, despite what they tried to bring about the final solution. There was a certain person I knew very well. He and his wife survived Auschwitz. And he told me he was 17 years old in Auschwitz. And the Klosenberger Rebbe in Auschwitz, he was a Hungarian Jew, this person, he provided Negelwasser. That means he put water by the beds, by the bunks of these teenagers, that when they woke up in the morning, water, they should be able to wash their hands. He told me, if not for the Klosenberger Rebbe, he would have lost his belief in God. Because he saw things that he questioned whether there is a God, because how could God allow this level of atrocity to take place? And he shared many things he saw, which it's enough to lose your mind. I'll give you one example, which is difficult even to say. They would take a young baby and hold the child by its legs and smash its head against a brick wall. This was the atrocity. He told me he was ready to lose his mind and to lose his belief in God. And the Klosenberger Rebbe, and there were hundreds of young men like himself, experienced the same horrors. And if not for the Rebbe, they would all given up Judaism in the blink of an eye. And he himself was like a lion. He built in Netanya, there's a hospital called Laniado Hospital. Laniado Hospital was built by the Klosenberger Rebbe. It had initially the only neonatal clinic for newborns, because he said, we will rebuild. And that hospital was for infants. It was like really for young newborns, the most sophisticated medicine for newborns. For that reason, Mr. Glick told me that when the Klosenberger Rebbe came over, he spoke in Williamsburg, Mr. Glick was there, and he just started to grow back his beard. Of course, they shaved his beard, shaved everything there in the camps. And he had a jet black beard, and he spoke to a few hundred people. He said to me, Mr. Glick, and Mr. Glick is no slouch, as you all know who he is. He says his eyes were like glowing coals, and his mouth was like a flamethrower. That's how the words came out of his mouth. He was like a lion. Nothing was going to stop him. Despite what they tried to do, despite that, and he gave such confidence, it was not to be believed. You understand? That he had to be that Torah giant to come back with a fierceness. But the average person, you're crushed, you're destroyed. Every Jew, when they left Egypt, was infected with a level of impurity humanly impossible to deal with. Kiyotzi Hashem Misham Mitzrayim. And now we can understand and appreciate what we see in the Agora, that if Hashem wouldn't have taken us out of Egypt, regardless how wise we are, we'd still be slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. What does that mean? You know, if a person has a genetic defect and repeats itself generation after generation, you could be 20 generations down the road, you still have that defect. If that impurity wouldn't have been expunged at this moment, every Jew till the end of time would be carrying that impurity. We'd still be slaves. Doesn't mean physically enslaved. We'd be enslaved by that evil that was infused in us due to that experience we experienced in Egypt. That's the understanding. So when Yisro realized how it was expunged, it was purged from us, it was beyond beyond his belief. He was amazed. I'm going out to the desert to become part of this special people. Because if God did that, they're going to be special, and they are special for that reason. There was a person, his name was Rebbe Lapian, mentioned Zecher Tzarech Levrocha. He himself studied in Kelm. It was a small town in Lithuania. And his Rebbe, his teacher, was the Alta of Kelm. He was the most special student of Rebbe Yisro Salanter. His name was Rebbe Simcha Zissel Ziv. And Rebbe Lapian was a very holy man. And as I mentioned in the past, at the age of 27, he had an experience with Eliyahu Novi at the age of 27. And he himself, when he was in Europe, he had a very special relationship with the Chafetz Chaim. Very special relationship. And at one time in his life in Europe, he would go travel from town to town, village to village, looking for special Jewish children to recruit them to go to yeshiva. Because when we think Europe was so religious, it wasn't. The impact of the Enlightenment movement brought about tremendous destruction and undermine and literally destroy Judaism. And he went from town to town, village to village, and he came and he met this 14-year-old boy. And this 14-year-old boy, he meets him. He never met such a genius in his life. At the age of 14, he owned 20 paint stores, like Sears Roebuck in Lithuania. At the age of 14, he was a multimillionaire, phenomenal genius, never met such a boy. And this boy's grandfather was one of the Gedolei Yisrael, and the boy couldn't read Hebrew. What happened? His mother was widowed when he was a little boy. It was him and his sister. And his mother married a man who was barely observant. And he was given a secular education, no Jewish education. And he meets this young boy, 14 years old, a genius, one of a kind. And he speaks to him. And he says to him, I see something very special in you. I want to invite you to come to Tel's Yeshiva. They had a preparatory school. Come for 6 weeks. Come at the beginning of Elul, stay through Yom Kippur, Sukkot, and you go back. And he thought by coming and having that experience, it would make, and being so brilliant, it would make a difference in his life. And he, within a few weeks, he learned how to read. He had comprehension. He rose in the ranks. That he went from the lowest level to the most advanced level in 6 weeks. Okay. After 6 weeks, he went back to his previous life. Finally, came back to him again. He says, and he encouraged him to go. Next time he went, he decided to stay. He sold off all his stores, sold them off. And he became a leading force in outreach, pre-World War II, during World War II, post-World War II, in Paris. His name was Reb Mordechai Pagramansky, one of a kind of a genius. And Reb Eli Lapian said that he believes it was worthwhile to come into this existence for Reb Mordechai Pagramansky to bring him back to Judaism. Could you imagine? Reb Eli Lapian, who mentored thousands of Torah students, made a difference in their lives to believe in God at a special level. And he said, this one person, for this person alone, it was worthwhile for him to come into this existence to bring this one Jew back to Judaism, which was an unbelievable feat. God creates the world for the Jewish people and for the sake of Torah. We're impacted so negatively beyond recovery. And Yisro appreciated that, beyond recovery. God says, I will bring about full recovery and beyond full recovery. Yisro had an appreciation for that. If this is what it's about, that's where I am. Just to give you an understanding, an inkling of an understanding. We can't even relate to who Yisro was, his capacity to be able to internalize the reality of what was going on. He took Tzipora, the wife of Moshe, and her 2 children out to Moshe Rabbeinu in the desert. And the Torah tells us, V'yomer al Moshe, ani chosedcho Yisro bo elecho. He's informing him. He sent the messenger, I'm coming. Not only am I coming, Ishtcho, your wife, Ushnei v'nei imo, and her 2 children, which are your 2 sons. So Rashi cites the Chazal, Midrash, your father coming to see you. Im enato yotze bigini. If you're not going to come out to greet me on my behalf because of who I am, say begin ishtcho. You should come out on behalf of your wife. If not on the behalf of your wife, you should come out to greet me on behalf of your 2 sons. I mean, Yisro was a one of a kind of a person. But Yisro says, if you're not going to come out to greet me on my behalf, it should be your wife. If not your wife, if that's not sufficient, it should be your 2 sons. I mean, why would Yisro even think that Moshe would not come out to greet him? The Midrash tells us that there were 2 individuals that nobody ever experienced such a degree of honor in the history of the world. Who are they? Yaakov, the father of Yosef, and Yisro, the father of Moshe. Why? Because the Torah tells us that when Yosef, who was the viceroy of Egypt, who was the equivalent of the king of Egypt, when he hitched his chariot to go greet his father, what do you think happened? All the ministers of Egypt followed. If the ministers go, you don't think the populace went? Every Egyptian went out to greet Yaakov. So the glory and esteem and reverence Yaakov had, nobody experienced that in the history of the world. Moshe Rabbeinu went out to greet Yisro. If Moshe went out to greet Yisro, Moshe, the greatest Jew, don't you think Aaron and his son went out to greet Yisro? And if Aaron and his 4 sons went out, don't you think the 70 elders of Israel went out? Don't you think the princes went out? And don't you think the whole Jewish people went out to greet him? Therefore, Yisro was the second individual who had this level of honor, the greatest honor ever accorded to a human being. Now, who is Yisro? Yisro initially was a high priest of idolatry. Even though now he's become what we call a Baal Tshuva. He's a penitent. He's repented. He's a monotheist today. But who is Moshe going to honor? You know, we think certain things are special. He deserves the honor, but you never know. There are all kinds of takeaways. Everybody has his own takeaway. And the takeaway may not be a good takeaway. Yisro appreciated that. If you don't come greet me for me, which I understand why, because I have a checkered past of idolatry, and people may think that has some background, gives me some value, and Moshe is acknowledging that, therefore Moshe is not coming. Because there's, under no circumstances will Moshe indicate that background has any value. But you may come out for your wife, but even for her you may not come out. Why? Because she was a Midianite. She was a convert. But what about your 2 sons? Maybe you'll come out for them. But it says, the Torah says, no, he came out for Yisro. Why did he come out for Yisro? To acknowledge Yisro. So there's an unbelievable midrash. The midrash says, Rabbi Lezer Omer, V'yomel Moshe, HaKadosh Baruch Hu Amar lo Moshe. God says to Moshe, Ani umarti she'voy olam. I'm the one who decreed that the world should come into existence. Anu she'mikarev v'ini merach. I am one who brings close and I don't push away. Shenemar quotes a verse from Yirmiyah, Jeremiah. Helokei bikorov ani num Hashem, v'lo elokei mirochok. I'm the God from close and not the God from a distance. Anihu shekirafti liyisro v'vichaktiv. What does a person have a merit to come upon truth? Because God wanted him to have that merit, because Yisro was special. So God says, I personally brought Yisro close to me. The reason why he came to monotheism was because of me. There was a special intervention. I did not push him away because of his past. But despite his past, I brought him close. Vavator. And identically, you, Odom Shabo Etzchel, this guy here, a person who's coming to you to convert, to become part of the Jewish people, Korveu v'atarchikeu. Therefore, you should bring him close. Do not push him away. This is God, a charge from God. Miyad, immediately, immediately when God gave him that charge, went out immediately. God says, there's no negative takeaways here. Nobody could have a bad, you don't have to be concerned. Moshe v'Aaron v'Nod v'Avihu u'zakenim chol Yisrael. Every Jew went out to greet him. But why? Because God says, since I went and brought him close and did not push him away, you must bring him close and don't push him away. You must value him. There's another midrash that says, Hashem says, for a person to abandon his pagan beliefs, it's not simple. It takes a tremendous amount of sacrifice to cut your ties with your past and reject everything And despite what the world has to say, you want to become a Jew? God said, if that's the case, you can't push away that kind of person. Because I gave him the internal stamina to be able to withstand all the reasons why I should not. Therefore, you bring them close, don't push them away. Just include a story. Many years ago, there's a law firm called Skadden Arps in New York. And a close student of mine was a lawyer there. And there was a Korean girl who worked there, not Jewish. And this person who's my Talmud says to me, there's this Korean girl, she wants to convert. Would it be okay for me to bring her to you to speak to her? And I told her that if she's coming to you, there's no nonsense. I will tell it to her exactly as it is. And she came to see me, this Korean girl, she must have been then about 30 years old. And has relevance to this. And she sits down. I said to her, why do you want to convert? She says, because I admire the Jews. I want to be a Jewess. I said, you know something? I said, are you dating a Jewish boy? It's the first thing I asked her. Is that the conflict of interest? She says, I am. And I said, and who are his parents? Holocaust survivors. And if he would marry this girl, if she's not converted, his parents said, we lived through a Holocaust. To have our son marry a non-Jew, they'd commit suicide, his parents. So I said, are you converting because this young man wants to marry you? She says, no. Even if he'd leave me immediately, I still want to be a Jew. I said, why? Because I admire it. I said, don't you realize it's foolishness what you're doing? Right now, your time is your time. There's no such thing as restriction. You can do anything you want, except violating the 7 no-hide laws. You do what you want. You can have every sexual relationship except adultery and incest. Everything. You're not restricted by time. No holidays, no Sabbath, nothing. You can eat anything you want. You have an unrestricted life. Why should you give it all up? Because you want to be a Jew. Doesn't make any sense. So she says to me, well, she spent the holidays with friends in Philadelphia and she admired the Jewish family life, this and that and that. I said, I think it's an irrational decision. Person as intelligent as you are, it seems to be you have a moment of instability. That's why you consider becoming a Jewess. This is what I told her. Because you're supposed to discourage a person only if the person truly wants to be a Jew, only then do you accept them to begin the process. I said, why don't you go think about it and come back for a second. We'll have a second meeting. She comes back. She says, I thought it over. Regardless of what I have to give up, I want to be a Jew. That's what she says to me. And she meant it. I said, you realize you're going to have to go to Israel and study for about a year to be educated and be exposed to certain things to have the orientation to become a Jew. And she comes back to me a third time. She says to me, I changed my mind. I said, why? With your level of altruism and sincerity and purity, why? She says, because my parents are Christian Koreans of the Christian belief. And they said to me, if I convert, every member of the family will ostracize me and I have no family. For that, I wasn't willing to give that up. Therefore, I'm not converting. So for a person to give up everything, cut himself off, to give up his whole past, his glory, everything, it's not a simple matter. But if a person does, what is the level of sacrifice? It's enormous. But that person, God put in his mind and his emotion to give that person the inner strength to be able to deal with all these issues. And that's what God says to Moshe. I brought him close. I didn't push him away. And as I brought him close, didn't push him away, you should go and do whatever you can to bring him close and allow him and encourage him to convert to become a Jew. Okay, we're going to stop here.